Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give thanks to Paul Sawyier Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer Diane Mahoney for all the amazing work she and her staff do in helping to put these lectures together for you all. And many thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and hosting them on their YouTube channel. I want to remind everyone that our fall season of the lecture series was unveiled last month, and you can find the schedule on the library's website as well as frankfortheritageweek.com, and we also have flyers in the back on the back table. I also want to let you know that we have scheduled 2 pop-up lectures, one on June 25th at 6 p.m. regarding Green Hills Cemetery's upcoming National Register of Historic Places nomination, as well as another lecture on August 27th at 6 p.m. on Kentucky's paleontology and the fossil record, presented by Daniel J. Phelps, founder and president of the Kentucky Paleontological Society. So make sure you mark those on your calendar. Like our speaker last month, our speaker today was one of 4 speakers at our 4-hour Founding Frankfort 250 Symposium last summer, right here at the library, that celebrated the 250th anniversary of Hancock Taylor's original survey of Frankfort. So we wanted to invite her back to give a more detailed version of her presentation. While some events are important to commemorate, such as Hancock Taylor's survey of Frankfort, which marked the beginning of white European settlers moving west further into the lands of Native Americans, as well as the upcoming 250th birthday of the United States, these events were not without their complications, and it is important for us to remember and acknowledge that. The land that we celebrate founding and settling, the government that we established on this land, and the successes that we tout as celebratory markers of our progress came at the cost of millions of lives, the destruction of cultures that have existed for thousands of years, and the erasure of cultural histories. Many of the narratives that we were taught in school were inaccurate, misrepresented, or were flat out manufactured to further the glorification and the legacies of white Europeans. The Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series is intended to align with the efforts and purpose of the United States Semi-Quincentennial Commission, also known as the America 250 Commission, leading up to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence next year. The mission and vision of the America 250 campaign is, quote, to commemorate and celebrate our 250th anniversary with inclusive programs that inspire Americans to renew and strengthen our daring experiment. It goes on, quote, the shared experiences of America 250 will have ignited our imaginations, elevated our diverse stories, inspired service in our communities, and demonstrated the lasting durability of the American project. For far too long, we have allowed inaccurate, over-glorified, sugar-coated, or outright false narratives of people, communities, and events to be inserted in the historical record, where they get repeated, recited, and redocumented, and re-permeated in the collective consciousness of society. For those reasons, these narratives can be very difficult to untangle from our history and our worldview. That is why we invited our speaker today and created this 2-part series on the history of American Indians in Kentucky and Franklin County. Hopefully you will take what you've learned today and help correct the record in conversations you have about the history of the United States. As a reminder, the second part of this 2-part series will be on July 13th and will feature Dr. Gwen Henderson, Director of Education of the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, who will discuss Kentucky's American Indian history as told through the archaeology of Franklin County. Only about 3% of Franklin County has been surveyed by archaeologists. Within that approximately 2,700 acres, there are over 200 archaeological sites, with about 160 of those having Native American components. From about 200 years ago to nearly 11,000 years ago, Native Americans lived in Kentucky and in Franklin County. And with that, I will hand it over to Diane Mahoney, Community Services Librarian, to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, John. As he said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian here at Paul Sawyer. And on behalf of the library, I just want to welcome you out this afternoon. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. What a wonderful crowd. All right. Today I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Tressa Brown. She received her BA in Biology and Anthropology at Transylvania University and her MA in Anthropology and Museum Studies from Arizona State University. She is currently the coordinator for the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission, the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. She has worked for the past 25 years providing Native American educational programming for schools and the public. Her primary focus has been to identify the stereotypes and myths about Native Americans in general and Kentucky's Native people in particular. Her position at KHC is to provide accurate information to educators and the public about Kentucky's American Indian history, the diversity of Native cultures, as well as the issues affecting Native people in contemporary society. Please help me to welcome to the podium, Tressa Brown.
Are we turned on? We're turned on? Are we turned on? Like I said, I'm Tressa Brown. Nice to meet you all. I'm a cultural anthropologist. So from pretty much the earliest that I can remember, I've been interested in American Indian people. I'm not Native. As far as I know, I have no Native ancestry, but I certainly am an ally for those communities. What we're going to talk about today is the stereotypes, where they came from, how they affect people, especially in the Native community, but all of us. And then we're going to look specifically at 4 or 5 issues that affect Native people in particular, and that the federal government and some state governments have created laws to protect those communities. So generally, when we start thinking about American Indians or Native Americans, depending on which group you're speaking with and speaking to, we use those terms interchangeably. Indigenous people, if you want to be more inclusive worldwide. But a lot of times, these are the sorts of images that pop into our head. The war cry, you know, painted, befeathered, on the horseback, screaming, or you know, riding out of their teepee village to go raid somebody or hunt buffalo or something like that. That's kind of the image that's in our head. And there is a reason for that. There's a really good reason for that. One of the things is, from on the East Coast early on, Native people looked very, very different. Their customs, their regalia, the houses that they lived in, the life that they lived was very different from what people experienced when they got west onto the plains specifically. So what the Eastern European and the Eastern American were used to seeing east, when they got across the Mississippi River, things were quite different. So within these stereotypes, there are 3 or 4 main kind of categories. One is the Disney version that's the child of nature. They can speak to animals, they understand animals and the songs that are in the wind and the whole 9 yards. They are the first ecologists, environmentalists. That is kind of that genre when it comes to stereotyping. The second is the noble red man. He's doomed. We all know he's doomed, but you know, we're gonna kind of hold him up because of his nobility and his sense of honor with regard to his own people. And then you have the savage red man, which is exactly what it sounds like. The illustrations, the stories that were kind of circulated from probably the mid-1600s all the way up into the late 1800s were of this savagery. And then you have the caricature, whether it's the drunken Indian or whether it's the cartoon or the mascot. You have, this is kind of the groups that these stereotypes fall into. So when we're talking about especially the noble savage, the savage, and the child of nature, these spring from essentially 4 or 5 events. These are the kind of the indices for those 4 or 5 events. So the first thing that happened is that Prince Maximilian hired George Catlin to paint for him and to record his trip across the American West. And this is in the 1830s. But Carl Wagner was a landscape artist. He was classically trained. He was very good. And he would take 2 or 3 days to do one painting. Very detailed paintings of the Mandan, the Rickarod, some of the other Plains tribes. And these are all Plains Indian people, different tribes, but essentially these are the images of these folks in their day-to-day life. Sometimes there are some images where people put on kind of their best clothes. But this is generally the type of thing that Carl Wagner was presenting to the public once he returned to Europe, to the East Coast, and to Great Britain and surrounding areas. These paintings are now used by many of the historical societies of those tribes, the tribal historians, for accuracy, because we know that these were painted from life, and he was very accurate in his depiction of these folks. You also have George Catlin, who's an American self-taught painter. He was touring the American West in the 1830s. He basically was going to document the vanishing red man of the plains. He went to some of the same villages during the same time frame that Carl Wagner was out there. His paintings, he would do 2 or 3 in a day, so there's less detail. Maybe I should stand on the other side.
Turn down your mic.
I don't know how to do that. She'll get me. These images that we have seen touted because, number one, he was an American artist, but also because of the imagery that he produced has been reproduced, for a couple hundred years now. And, if this is not the poster child of our idea of a Native American, I don't really know what is. This is where it started. So these images of Plains people in their own regalia, their own dress, doing things that they would do pretty much on a daily basis. And there were some images of the camps as well, of the villages. Some of these villages were teepee villages, and some of them were big earth lodges, which would house all of us, plus some people. Are probably, certainly 20 people easily, plus the men's favorite horses were in earth lodges. So they were big, they were permanent structures, so they weren't teepees like people normally think of American Indians living in. So you have these and these images as a package being delivered to the East Coast for gallery shows. Especially Catlin's whole point was to create basically some money for himself, some profit for himself. He wanted to do a portfolio and sell the whole portfolio. That didn't work out as well as he had thought, so he traveled from city to city, major urban centers on the East Coast of the United States, in Great Britain, and in Europe, showing his paintings, hoping to sell them. So what happened is people saw those, and that was their introduction to the American Indian for the most part. Following that, you had penny dreadful novels being printed. You had, this started in England, and then it came over to the United States. As soon as the railroad went through, distribution was a breeze. So they started churning out these little novels that had, the Indian is the bad person. This was the savage red man. So they were adding this layer of kind of typically non-illustrated. Every so often you get a front illustration like this, but most of the stories were not illustrated, but they were about people going west being attacked by Indians and fighting off the Indians, and the Indians stealing kids and the Indians stealing women and that whole thing. So the more exciting you could make it, of course, the more you would sell. That was their point. So you had this whole piece of literature that was written on top of seeing those images from Bodmer and Catlin. These were distributed in the same areas, certainly once the railroad went through. And then they were distributed actually in Great Britain. I'm not sure about Europe, but Europe had their own kind of series of these things. All the stories made up. They were all fiction. You had a level of nonfiction that was added with the memoirs of U.S. servicemen serving in from the 1860s up to the 1880s. And sometime before that, but it became really prevalent for these officers once they finished their tour of duty, if they survived. They went back east and they did a lecture circuit, or they wrote and printed their memoirs, and then their wives would do lecture circuits. And what's going to fill the seats of your presentations? You tell them the juiciest, most horrifying tales that you can tell them. That's what they did. So they overlaid the printed word and the images with their supposedly true stories of the American Indian in the West. And if you'll notice, the guy who's leaning with his legs crossed, the third one in from the left, that's Custer, and his wife is just across the railing. So frequently, the wives of officers would be out there, and when they returned, of course, they would tell their own version of the stories. Also, there were accounts that were printed in the newspapers. This is 1882, and all the language they used, you know, savage attacks and let's see, horrible accounts of murders by the Redskins. So, and this was supposed to be true accounts of events in the West. So you had the spoken, you had the fiction, and essentially kind of sort of nonfiction from the newspapers. And later on, you also had other people starting to paint Western scenes, or scenes of American battles in the Western the Indian Wars. Frequently, these paintings were created decades following the event. So this is a wholly fictionalized account of Battle of Little Bighorn. The cavalry was at pretty much no time after the initial engagement were they on their horses, and the native people were on their horses. That's why they got the event that they did. So you have this layering effect on top of Catlin and Bodmer's images. You had spoken accounts, you had written accounts, and you had other dramatized kind of portraiture of what was happening. And then you had somebody that came along and put the entire package together. Buffalo Bill Cody was the preeminent entertainer of the day. These are also, during the time that all of this was happening, you also had these penny dreadful novels kind of graduated into illustrated, these little illustrated, essentially the forerunner of a comic book. But they were printed material, the colorized top image, and then the inside is just printed. So these were from the 1870s, 1880s. This one is looks like 1907. This was 1915. This one is 1922. I can remember reading stuff that had these kind of images on it in the 1970s and 80s. So it hadn't stopped, okay? Until quite recently, it hasn't stopped. These images, again, overlaid on all of the Bodmer and Catlin and the lecture circuits and the memoirs and all that kind of stuff. And then, like I said, Buffalo Bill Cody put the entire package together. Because what did he do? He hired native people of the plains, actual Plains Indian people, to travel with his Wild West show and reenact scenes. And essentially, they were always the bad guys, and they were always either shot or run off by the cavalry actors. The thing is that these people were wearing their own regalia. It was not costumes for them, it was their own stuff. So they were looking like exactly the images that Bodmer and Catlin painted. They were behaving like the printed and spoken and newspaper accounts. That's what people were seeing here. But it was kind of like a small version of the big things that happened in the Roman Colosseum of reenacting ancient battles. They were essentially doing the same thing on a fairly small scale for Buffalo Bill. But he would draw thousands of people to his shows. Where did he travel? East Coast, Great Britain, Europe. Same places, okay? And this is what really solidified this stereotype that we have of the American Indian. There's only one kind, right? This is the stereotype. And they all look like these guys. Guys. I said that purposefully because rarely did you have images or stories or an opportunity to see live Native American women, because almost always it was men that were depicted, and there were no women, to my knowledge, that traveled and were part of the exhibitions for Buffalo Bill Cody or any of the other Wild West shows. So, and these kind of things, like they would actually build a cabin in the middle of the arena, and then the little pioneer lady would go out with her bucket of water to, or to milk the cow or whatever, and the Indians would sneak in up on her, and then they would be run off by people in the cabin, or the cavalry would come over the hill into the arena and save the day. So, but he had actual Native people, and then as he traveled, he went to Europe with Sitting Bull went with him. So if you know Plains history, Sitting Bull was one of his entertainers at that point. And then when they started kind of deciding to go back home, he had to find new people, and smaller, less reputable Wild West shows or shows would hire people to act Indian. So it started a long time before, silent movies or any of that bit. So, and they did have whatever they could come up with that looked Indian for their costumes. So they would use different kinds of feathers, and they would just kind of make things up. So you have all of that leading up to and presenting us with these, when you have an opportunity to speak with the Native people that were touring, and there were Native people going back and forth to Washington from the early 1800s, certainly, and then certainly through the mid-1800s up to the 1880s, 1890s, the early 1900s even. There were contingents of Native tribal people, tribal representatives going to Washington, so people would see them in Washington. Most of them were Plains people. Most of them had some regalia on, and frequently when they got there, they would be in their native dress, and then by the time they went home, they had kind of a accumulated European pants or coats or hats or other stuff. One of the things that didn't change much was their footwear. They didn't really want to change over to European shoes. But so creating this image of, especially the way Bodmer and Catlin presented their work as these are images of the vanishing. They're not going to last. They're going to be gone. And so they became kind of this noble character. And that's what we see in a lot of the early movies. You have the noble person, the Indian friend, and then you have, the downright dirty dog, enemy. And that's the way that they were presented, even up through the 90s with Dances with Wolves. All the Lakota people were good, and all of the Crow people or Pawnee people were bad. So it's not like thinking about these groups as actual people, being good and bad, even in one person, like most of us are. But so this is the way that they presented to the general public, following those Penny Dreadful novels up into comic books, through all of the James Fenimore Cooper. You have the Noble Red Man, and then you have, all of the other savage guys that they're fighting. So if images of Last of the Mohicans pops to mind, you got the same dichotomy between all of the good guys, the Mohican guys are all good, and the other guys are all bad. So you have that. And Disney has done a wonderful job of really promoting this the first environmentalist and the first, the perfect noble red man, and sometimes woman, based on some of those old Pocahontas stories. The second piece, which has been much more dramatic because it draws people, the excitement, the warfare, all of that is going to draw your audience, and that's what people were doing from the very beginning with Wild West shows, showing this activity, this excitement and adventure, and then moving into silent movies and moving into what we have today up until about 20 years ago. We had, this is not that long ago. This is from Dances with Wolves. That's from Last of the Mohicans. So, and this actually is a text. This is an illustration in Kentucky middle school and high school textbooks. That's the image to depict Native American people, specifically in Kentucky. So, and you wonder why kids have a kind of skewed idea of who Native people are, especially here. What we need to start looking at is the actual people, the diversity of the actual people, and the fact that Native people are still here today, that they did not die out, they're not a vanishing race, the majority of them. There were some on the East Coast that were pretty much wiped out. But in general, when you speak about American Indians as a whole, nobody was wiped out. Okay? You have very vibrant tribal members, very vibrant tribal communities today in 2024. Okay? Choctaw. Now that top image and these two images here are Choctaw, Shawnee, Cherokee, and you'll notice they don't look anything like any of the Plains regalia. They don't have feathers for the most part. They don't have a lot of hide clothing. These people were impacted by European trade goods very early, so they had trade goods 150 years before the people on the plains. So they were wearing shirts and pants and hats and scarves and turbans, yes, for 100 years. So, and they were used to dealing with Europeans for 100 years, 200 years in some instances before the people on the plains met kind of the big contingents of Americans. This is Geronimo. So we want to also look here at the diversity of clothing, which indicates a diversity in cultures, in songs, in language, in the way people think about who they are and where they are. So these are actual photographs or paintings from actual people. They're not made up. So this is the real, as opposed to the stereotype. We have people today that are active participants in contemporary society, both women and men. If you don't know Robbie Robertson's history, you don't know rock and roll. Okay? Y'all don't. And some of these people may be more familiar to you than others. If you want to get a really quick take of right now, kind of the activism of the young Native American people, look up Christian Parrish. He's known as Supa Man. He's a rap artist. He started out being a rap artist. Rap is very popular on many of the reservations. But he kind of morphed over into being very proactive when it talked about speaking about Native American life today. So he's become kind of an activist, though that's not really what he calls himself, but he's fantastic if you haven't seen that kind of thing, to make yourself more familiar with who folks are today. These are resources where you can go for information specific to the American Indian story. If you don't want to write them down real quick, that's fine. You can always go to our website, my website, at the Kentucky Heritage Council, and or ask me. I'm happy to talk about books. We're in a library, right? We're all about that. So all of this sets up some of the issues that we have to deal with today as members of a general community, but specifically dealing with the Native American community. Even here in Kentucky, there are 90,000 people in Kentucky who identify as American Indian. 90,000. From the last census, we know that there are nearly 200 different tribes represented in the state. That's from Alaska all the way down to the tip of Central and South America, because those people are American Indians too, okay? So the definition of American Indian includes anybody North, Central, South America. It doesn't distinguish because they didn't distinguish. And even if we think of people as being Mexican, most of these people are Aztec or Mayan or Tarahumara or indigenous of some sort. So some of the issues, today there are 566, 567 tribes that are represented, that are recognized by the federal government. In other words, the federal government says, yep, I agree. You're a member of a tribe that we acknowledge and that we have treaties with, and that we will treat you as a sovereign nation. You have 64 tribes that are identified that way by their states. State-recognized tribes are not federally recognized tribes. Federal, although the laws that I'm going to speak about here in a minute do affect both sets. There are hundreds of thousands of people who don't fall into either category. They are essentially undocumented American Indians. They cannot trace their ancestry well enough to be enrolled in one of the tribal governments. So, Kentucky has no federal or no state tribes here, and there's no process by which the state could recognize a tribe. The requirements are stringent. You have to show uninterrupted like location here. You have to show uninterrupted government, tribal government, which is difficult. And part of this is the way that history happened in Kentucky, is that it makes it really, really difficult to have that unbroken line of history. These are the federal tribes that when projects happen in the state that have federal funds attached, there has to be consultation about the project with these tribal partners. These are the tribes who identify Kentucky as being part of their territory at one time, historic or earlier. Some of them, the Osage is one of the most recent, and they trace one of their oldest legends tracks back to a spring or a river in southeast Kentucky. So they don't have any other connection to our state, our area than that, but we will consult with them. The federal and state entities have to consult. You have, these are the North American tribes that we know are in the state. There are representatives. There could be just one. There could be a family. There could be a small community. But again, there are 500 different nations. There are about 300 different languages among Native people. So, and that's just in North America. That's not looking at Central or South America. So we're looking at Mexican tribes. Most of these, their languages are different from each other. Frequently, Spanish is not their first language. A native language is their first language, and sometimes it has to be translated at least twice into Spanish before you can get to another speaker. Again, in Central American tribes, so it's quite diverse with regard to any culture and quite diverse with regard to where these people originated. We know that a lot of the food that Native people consider the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, all except for the squash, all came from South America. It was traded and moved up into North America, and that's why corn, beans, and squash, these are the people that started all of that, and potatoes, and tomatoes, and peppers, and many of the things that Americans take for granted when you're fixing especially a summer meal. Again, more South American tribes. So if you'll notice this date, now one of the first presentation I did was talking about the history here. The history in Kentucky goes back 10 to 12,000 years, all right? We became a state in 1790, right? So, 1792. So it took how long before we had one law that protected Native people? 19 said that's within my lifetime. Well within my lifetime. Within my memorable lifetime, okay? So, and this happened because there were some folks up in the upper California that were trying to maintain their tribal religion, and state agencies were basically jailing them because they were using peyote, which is a narcotic cactus. It's a hallucinogenic cactus for part of their ceremony. It's very controlled within that session, and it's protected. And there are other religious ceremonies that go on around that. That's only part of it. It's kind of a small part of it, actually. But then they were also gotten for having pieces and parts of birds of prey, eagles in particular, that are on the Endangered Species Act. Nobody's supposed to have them. And so this is another place that it crossed over with Native religion, because birds of prey are wholly and spiritually connected to almost every Native American tribe, especially North American tribes, frequently South American as well. And so that means anything to do with those birds, whether it doesn't have to be an eagle, it can be a hawk, it can be an owl, it can be a condor, it can be any bird of prey, but they're considered sacred. And it wasn't until 1978 that Native people were allowed to continue their religious practices unhindered, because they could use a feather for a blessing ceremony. They could use an eagle bow and whistle in a ceremony. This would be taking these rights away from them, would be like telling you that if you're a Catholic, you cannot use a rosary, or if you're a Christian, you can't use a Bible. It's that basic. So this protected those rights for people who are federally recognized. Federally recognized. The second one was in 1978, Indian Child Welfare Act, and some of this has been in the news for a while, especially when the system is not engaged at the beginning of a child's, court appearance, as it were. So what happened is, through the years, Native people, their children have been removed from their homes forcibly, stolen, and they were either sold as indentured servants, or sold into, people said that they adopted them, but they were being paid, they had to pay money to adopt these children, or they were used as servants in the home or on the farm. There were industrial schools that were put into place in the mid to late 1800s, all the way up into the mid-1900s, the 1950s. These residential schools, many of these children did not go home. Many of these children, it was the Pratt policy was kill the Indian and save the child, which means divorcing and separating that child from their entire culture, language, dress, songs, food, everything. History, everything is, you've removed them from the community and you remove them from the culture, and teach them how to be a boot maker or a wagon wheel maker or whatever, very utilitarian jobs. And then you're gonna hope that they become a member of the community that can support themselves. Well, when they went back home, when they were able to go back home, they didn't fit in because they didn't know the language, they didn't know the customs, they half the time didn't even know their own family anymore. So they were in this limbo land, okay? And so after a while, the federal government said, this practice is wrong. We need to stop taking these kids from the homes. So the Indian Child Welfare puts the tribal government in charge of placing those children when they're removed from their parents or whoever's home they're in. When they're removed, they go to the tribal authorities get to say where those children go. And it's up to the tribal authority to agree to allow a child to be adopted outside of their tribe or outside of any other tribe. So that's a protection to keep those kids connected to some Native identity. So that's in 78. And then you have 1990, okay? 90. Indian craft, arts and crafts, and this had kind of a two-prong effect. One was that Native artisans were getting undercut in a major way by a lot of imported items, whether it was from Japan or Taiwan or wherever. A lot of beadwork, a lot of pottery, a lot of blankets and rugs were produced elsewhere, brought into the United States, and then sold as American Indian. This was a huge, huge business. It's still fairly huge in some venues. But with this law, it said you have to have one of two signs. If you have material that appears to be American Indian, you have to have one or two signs on your table. You have to say Native inspired if you have no Native ancestry, or it has to say tribally enrolled and what your credentials are. You cannot have, it's not buyer beware. You have to have one sign or the other. So if you go to a fair or a festival or a powwow, people should have a sign that says tribally enrolled, here's my tribal enrollment number, or it should say Native inspired. So you know that these people are not tribal members and these people are, so that if you want to preference Native art from tribally enrolled people, you can do that. Or you can buy whatever else you want, but you have to be aware of that. And that has helped the Native craft and art market flourish now. But there's still, every so often, like in the Santa Fe market, they nailed a number of people not very long ago. A lot of stuff was made kind of commercially, essentially. So you still have that problem. And the last one that really, really affects Native communities was started here in 1988 maybe. Union County, Kentucky, there was a farm right up against the river that had been in a family for generations. The patriarch died. He had 2 or 3 kids. The land was divided among them, and one of them sold the land. The family knew that there was a cemetery on that site, an early Native cemetery, thousands of years old. Okay, and so the one person sold it, and then the buyer of that leased it to pot hunters, to looters, knowing that this is what they were going to do. So he leased the land for, I don't know, $10,000 or whatever it was. And these folks methodically went out, dug up the graves, threw out the skeletal remains, and there were considerably a lot of them, and looked for the goodies, the points in the jewelry and things like that, that they could sell on the open market, either online, now you can see this stuff all the time, or in relic shows. Now they say that they're only showing their stuff, but like anything, like any other lucrative illicit trade, the deals are going to be made behind closed doors. So we know that if you see a big, pretty piece, more than likely it's one of two things. It's grave goods or it's fake. It's been made by somebody more recently. Ceramics, you don't find whole pots unless you've dug something up or found it in a burial in a rock shelter. So this, because of this event, federal agencies put into play this Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which means it's a felony to loot graves, essentially. But the problem is actually you have to be caught in the act of it. So it's hard to prove. A lot of policing agencies don't want to spend the time to do that. because a lot of times by the time it gets to the judge doesn't feel like it's really, you know, we have more serious things to deal with. So sometimes it's really, they don't get any kind of criminal record for this kind of behavior, and it's hard to prove. But at least it's on the books, and it actually, Kentucky's laws with regard to looting are more stringent than federal law, which makes it a little bit easier. And we have had a couple of people that have been nailed and jailed and fined for looting. And there have been big rings out in the Southwest and in, well, Northern Plains in the Southwest of these rings of looters that were stealing sacred items, cultural items from Pueblo peoples, and then also digging folks up. So this is, and just recently they put a separate kind of codicil onto this so that any of the museums and historical agencies that have collections, especially human remains, they have to connect with and consult with tribes and consult with them to see if that material can be returned to the tribe. Frequently, like at Wycliffe Mounds, all of the skeletal remains that were removed from Wycliffe Mounds that were in Murray have all been reburied with the help of the Choctaw people out of Oklahoma. So they came, they did a ceremony, they reburied all of them. And that's what should happen. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for this law being put into place. And the little extra piece that was put on is that you can't say, oh, it's unidentifiable. We can't connect it to a historic tribe. That's no longer a legitimate excuse for not doing the job. So we have, UK has quite a large collection. There are a couple other institutions in the state that are now working diligently to consult with tribes and get these materials returned appropriately. Do y'all have questions? That's a lot of information. And it affects us today because all of this impacts the way we think about American Indian people. When I do a lot of school presentations, and kids will go, well, some of the teachers too, will say, well, I didn't know there were any Indians left in Kentucky. And that tells me two things. One is you think that somehow there was a concerted effort, and there was a concerted effort to move people that were identified as Cherokee and Shawnee and Chickasaw and Choctaw out of any place east of the Mississippi River removal. But we don't recognize, we have an idea in our heads that Native peoples haven't changed with the times. That we should be able to recognize a Native person because they have feathers and beads and war paint on. And since we don't see those people, they must not be in our communities. Not so much, right? Not so much. We don't dress like Abraham Lincoln did. We don't dress like George Washington did, even though we may claim ancestry to those people. We have our customs, the way that we've done, have changed over time. Native people, same thing. They're just human beings, right? But we have this kind of image in our head that we need to combat actively to say, okay, I need to step back and think about how I'm thinking about indigenous people. And think about the language that I use. One of the, we have a poster in the back that has Kentucky's Before Boone. It has images on it, and it has time frames for the different history. And one of the time frames is like woodland period, paleo period, archaic period, and prehistoric period. Okay, and you know, in the academic circles, you talk about paleo people or archaic people or prehistoric people. Well, there are no prehistoric people. What does prehistory mean? We don't have anything before history. It's before Europeans started writing it down, but it's not before history. It's just before you paid attention. You know, so we have all of this native knowledge that's been passed down through generations and generations Some of it's been lost, some of it's been regained, some of it is being taught again in the languages. People are reclaiming their languages, which is fantastic. But all of that points to us not really being able to identify Indian people individually or a group outside of Indian. You know, it's not like there's just one kind. I mean, off the top of my head, the people that I deal with on the commission are Powhatan, Anishinaabe, Cherokee, Shawnee, Apache, Mohawk, it's up in Maine and it's gone completely out of my head. Wabanaki, so there's many, many different tribes with their own ways of doing things. Cherokee and Shawnee people were here. Different language, different customs, different type ways of setting up households, different ways of acknowledging who your family is. One's matrilineal, one's patrilineal, and they were here in Kentucky. Both claim ancestry to Kentucky. Shawnee have a better claim because it's older. Cherokee came in from further south. That's why we have Cherokee and Shawnee, and most everybody, because they've heard of the Cherokee, say, oh, I'm probably Cherokee. Maybe not. And then on the very end, the little squished piece of the toe of Kentucky, that's Chickasaw. Nobody ever contends that. Nobody ever says, oh, no, it's, yeah, it is, and nobody claims otherwise down there. You also have smaller tribes, Yuchi and Tulo and Tuponi people in kind of the mid and south and southeast regions of the state, smaller groups, that nobody's heard of, unless you're one of them. And they're around. So I think that it pays us to really start thinking about the way we use language and use it accurately. If we're going to say the pioneers of Kentucky, that's not Daniel Boone. Okay? That's not Thomas Walker. That's not James Herod. That is the native people that came in here 10,000 years ago. Pioneer, first people in an area. The first. You can only have the first once. And it happened thousands and thousands of years ago. Everybody else is a Johnny-come-lately settler. Okay? And that includes other native people. So you have to kind of recalibrate our head and our brain and the way that we think about things so that we don't inadvertently contribute to these stereotypes. And that's the bottom line with my job and the job of the commission. Give you good information, ask you to start thinking about the way you think about things, and basically hope for the best from there. We have done a phenomenal job of utilizing our partners through the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, through Kentucky Organization of Professional Archaeologists, through Living Archaeology Weekend, of getting that word, that good history out to people. One of the upcoming presentations is going to be by Gwen Henderson. I highly recommend her information. She and her husband are essentially the two primary people that have done the archaeology in Kentucky that informs us about how things are. And man, do they have 30 years plus of that information that they can pull together, and she can present it in a really, really fun and engaging way. And that all of her information just comes up right to this information that I've just presented. Because we all learn from everything that's been balanced on top of everything else. But some of that we gotta play a Jenga game and say, oh yeah, not that one, and toss that one out, toss that block out, because all these stereotypes don't do anything but set up a miscommunication between the native, the indigenous communities and us, or anybody who wants to ally with them, anybody who wants to learn from them, because we have to kind of get rid of those erroneous ideas before we can really understand what's actually happening. So, y'all questions? Yes?
Were several tribes able to reside peacefully with their own areas in Kentucky at the same time?
Yes. Were there a number of different tribes residing in Kentucky peacefully? More or less. More or less. There was tribal warfare between Shawnee and Cherokee, we know that. because the Cherokee came in and started kind of pressing the Shawnee people. There were people from up north that were coming down into this area raiding. So there was a lot of back and forth and movement. There was also a couple of epidemics that kind of swept through this area and depopulated this whole area, so that when the Europeans kind of first started coming in, they didn't see the large populations that used to be here. They saw evidence of that, but they didn't see the people. But yes, there were a lot of alliances going on, and I think that we have to think broader of Kentucky because there was no state boundary to the native communities. So rivers were essentially some of the boundaries. So yeah, back and forth across the Ohio. Yes, ma'am.
Do I understand it right that the grave robbing in Union County, Kentucky is what inspired the federal protection?
That is it. You got it on the nail. What happened in Union County, Kentucky, essentially kicked off NAGPRA. Yes, that's it. Yes, sir.
Where do the Melungeons fit into this, or don't they fit into it?
I think they do fit in because I think they have Cherokee and Shawnee ancestry. They also have other European ancestry. Some people say Portuguese or somebody else. I think that, especially in eastern Kentucky, there's been a fair mix between African American, Native American, and European, wherever the European come from, whether they're British European or Portuguese Europeans or wherever. I think there's been a fair mix in eastern Kentucky, and I think that because of a number of kind of converging traditions, one in food and one in music, that you see. Clogging looks to me a lot like stomp dance, which is Shawnee and Cherokee, but then you have music and ballads that are very African oriented, especially with banjo music, with the lyrics coming in from Europe. So I think Melungeons are a real thing, and I think they do have Native ancestry.
But they are not part of your commission officially?
No, sir, they are not. We don't have it. There have to be 8 members of our commission that have Native ancestry. To my knowledge, nobody speaks of that ancestry as a Melungeon. Some of them are tribally relevant, some are not. So we have a fairly wide variety. I know a lot of Melungeon folks, and some of them do preference the native part of their ancestry. So, yes, sir.
I'm not understanding exactly what you're saying. Malaysian?
Melungeon. Melungeon. It's a term used for East Tennessee, Appalachian region, where the Appalachian is. And it's a mixture of people. Typically, they may have darker skin, darker hair, and some of the history basically goes back to Native American, African American, and Eastern European Portuguese.
My brother, there were people when we were growing up, I'm old from town, that were darker skinned and lived around Painesville, up in the hills, and they called them the Turkey Walkers.
Yep.
And they told us not to go up there around the turkey. I just remember that was the name they called it, because the turkeys were up in the trees.
It's called turkey knob.
Right.
Separately.
And in eastern Kentucky and in far western Kentucky, there are kind of enclaves of Native ancestry, and that frequently people say, we don't associate with them, and then within those groups, they would kind of divorce themselves from their own Native history so that they could fit in socially and economically. They'd say, okay, we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to pass as white or pass as black, and we're not going to connect with our Native ancestry because we'll get hammered for it. We'll get moved down here. They'll take our, they'll fire us from our jobs. They'll take our land or whatever. Yes, sir.
The recent film, Killers of the Flower Moon, is that less stereotyped and romantic than the previous media?
They had a lot of consultation with the tribes out there. So I think it's a fair representation. They have romanticized some aspects of it because it was a horrific piece of history. Killers of the Flower Moon, yeah. And there's a couple of other instances that are similar to that dealing with mining, dealing with basically economic incentive to kill folks and to divorce native peoples from their holdings. Yes.
We see and read and hear that there were 3 main tribes here in Kentucky in the early years. Cherokee up here in the east. Then in the west, the Shawnee. Where did the Chickasaw fit in of the 3 tribes?
In the far western tip of the state.
Okay, beyond Shawnee?
Yes, beyond Shawnee.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe from west of Henderson, certainly that little monkey's eyebrow kind of area, you know, where it's pinched in on the tip of Kentucky, all of that's Chickasaw. But it could have come a little bit further east than that to where Wycliffe Mounds is Chickasaw. That's right on the Mississippi River. It may come, I don't think it comes near as far as Hopkinsville, not that far.
That's the area?
Yes, sir.
Chickasaw?
Yes, sir.
When Andrew Jackson initiated or ignored the Supreme Court and had the Cherokee to move west to Oklahoma, did we have any Indians left?
Not as full communities. There were people still here. There were people who had, like I was speaking earlier, had kind of separated themselves from that heritage and were calling themselves and living as something else. They were just working in the coal mine. It didn't matter. They were just a warm body to sit down there. And I think that it bears remembering that everybody remembers the Trail of Tears. But there was removal happening for about 100 years prior to that. Everybody on the East Coast, especially everybody south of the Great Lakes, was removed, west of the Mississippi. Some of these people were moved to Missouri, and then moved again, and then moved again, moved 4 times before they got to Oklahoma. And every time they were told, this is yours forever. Yeah, forever is really short. So that period in history, a lot of people talk about it as the Indian Holocaust because so many people died, but there were worse things happening, I hate to say it, earlier than that. With the Plains Indian Wars, that whole period was either you kill them or you pacify them, and if you pacify them with a bullet, that's all good according to the federal government. That was the attitude at the time. They could not, especially when Lincoln was there, he was saying he could not fight 2 wars because the Civil War was starting. He could see it. So in the early 60s, he said, you got to finish the problem out west. He hanged 38 Lakota men in one shot to try to end that rebellion, what he called it, out west. That's the largest public hanging in U.S. history, signed off by Lincoln, because he could not fight 2 different wars. It was political. He had to make the decision, and there's a commemorative ride about that every year. I think they start in like November. It's awful weather through the beginning of January or something. So, it's called. Basically, if you look up Native American 38 plus 2, 38, because there were 2 people that should not have been hanged. They were not Lakota, and they were just collected with the 38 and all hanged. So they were actually hanged 40 people, but it was 38 plus 2. Yes, sir.
60 years ago or so, when I was a child, oftentimes Kentucky tourism out of Frankfort, we talked about Kentucky as a happy hunting ground, and the great myth of the time was that the Daniel Boone and so forth were well they were well-intentioned in moving in here because nobody lived in Kentucky, and that was just a hunting ground for those natives north of the Ohio River. And so, do we know the origin of that particular?
We do. We do. Well, here's the bottom line is, would you want to buy land from somebody that claims somebody else owns it?
Right.
You don't. It was economic.
Right.
It was wholly economic. Part of that had to do with when Europeans started coming into this area, they were seeing abandoned villages. They were seeing abandoned fields. They were not seeing these large concentrations of native people, not in villages. By that time, the Shawnee had moved north of the Ohio River. The Cherokee had been moved, were kind of thinning out and moving up into the more Appalachian and Smoky Mountain regions. And it was a very convenient thing for them to say, hey, yeah, everybody says it's just their hunting grounds. That's what the folks up around, the Great Lakes and up in New York say, that's just our hunting ground. Yeah, but those folks never lived there. Mohawk people claim Kentucky as their hunting ground. Shawnee people were actually living here, kind of, and burying their dead here for thousands of years. So it was a convenient advertisement that stuck. Yeah. And the whole dark and bloody ground thing, that was a misquote that kept being republished from John Filson's papers. And reprinted and reprinted and requoted and ad nauseum. And it was never to be taken for what people think it today is. Kentucky is, the dark and blood. No, it wasn't. They were basically saying, with this treaty, you're going to start some problems here. And sure enough, it did. So there's that, yes.
With the fluidity of the boundaries of different groups in Kentucky, and then archaeologists have a difficult time of really drawing where are those lines in prehistory, how do you deal with consultations when multiple tribes claim some prehistoric site as remains under that?
Yeah, it has happened that Shawnee and Cherokee both have claimed some things, and basically you just have to work with their tribal historic preservation officers, from the tribes and say, okay, this is the situation. Essentially, y'all need to work this out between you because we're not keeping this stuff. It needs to go. So the agencies really have to rely heavily on the actual individuals that you're consulting with to solve those kind of problems. And sometimes it's not an easy fix, and sometimes it's not a quick fix. We were just hearing at the beginning of this week an instance in which it took 5 years for all of the consulting parties to come to an agreement on where things would go. So sometimes those conflicts come up. It's less of a problem with stuff the further back you go. So, yeah. Yes?
I've been interested in seeking out a powwow to go to. Have you been? Is it something you'd recommend?
I would. She said she was looking for a powwow to go to. Powwow is basically a native dance contest. Some of them are contest powwows. Some of them are social powwows. Social powwows, it's like going to a football game. You have kind of the main event, and then you got everything else going on. You got vending of stuff. You have food. You have the guys checking out the girls, and you have the girls checking out the guys, and you're meeting with your old friends, and you're gathering together with your family. It's just a kind of a big reunion with dancing involved, but no contest. Contest powwow have categories of dancing that you can win prizes for, and sometimes the prizes are substantial, thousands of dollars. Some people go on a powwow circuit like people would go on a rodeo circuit, and they would win enough to put themselves through college that next year, or to buy a truck, or to do whatever, because they're really good at what they do. There's contests for the dancers, both men and women, and separated by age. And there's also contests for drummers and singers, and backup singers. There are women that sing as backup for the drum groups. If you've never seen that, you'd probably see that if you went to Hopkinsville powwow. Richmond powwow, I think, is not going to be able to continue. They'll be there this year. I think this is the last year for them. There's a powwow in London. There's a powwow, usually there's 2 powwows in Louisville. And then there's some in Tennessee. Within a drivable distance, just start looking for powwows in my area and they'll pop up. Yeah. So look for the ones that have been established the longest.
And that's a practice of multiple tribal nations? Or?
Powwow is basically, the music is plains, the regalia is plains, the dance style is plains, but everybody does it. It has become pan-Indian. It's kind of like, I don't know, everybody plays bluegrass music even though you're from California, okay? So it's kind of that sort of thing. It does 3 things. 1 is it brings the Native community together. 2, it passes on these traditions. And 3 is it's a way for the tribal people to include non-Indian people. Because they rely on, sometimes you pay to get in the gate, sometimes you don't. It's a place for them to vend their arts. It's a place for you to try good food. If you haven't had an Indian taco or fry bread, take the opportunity and do it, yeah. And it is open to the public. Yeah, so it's open to the public. They frequently, they'll have an MC, they'll have an arena director. Sometimes they will tell you the things that not to do, like you don't touch people's regalia. You ask if you want to have, if you can have a picture with somebody. You don't sit on the benches because those are for dancers because they have regalia that they can't sit on in a chair. You don't approach drums without proper protocol. So there's things that you would need to know, but essentially if you go in a respectful manner, and even if you make a mistake, say, oh, you know, I'm sorry, and be sincere, you're all good. They're just people. Yeah.
We've got a lot of questions now. Let's start with this one. This is a serious question. The pandemics that you mentioned, that impact the population. What were they, and do they have time frames of when that happened?
There were particular time frames. I think one of the earliest that came through was in the early 1700s, which was either influenza or cholera, and I can't remember. I keep thinking it was influenza. And the cholera epidemic swept through, and this is east of the Mississippi, not west. West of the Mississippi, it was cholera and smallpox. And smallpox was sometimes introduced purposefully. Again, that was the policy at the time. So, and that didn't just happen here in the United States. That happened elsewhere around the world as well. But, so there were a couple of different epidemics. The early 1700s, I think there was one that came in the late 1700s, and there could have been a couple earlier than that. And the thing about that is trade routes were extensive through this land. Archaeologically, we found obsidian, we found copper, we found marine shell, we have found feathers from Central and South America. Okay, it's not like people from Kentucky traveled there to get it, but that's where their trade routes extended. You know, hundreds of miles south and north. And so you wouldn't have to know, you don't have to know 1 or 2 trade partners, and not just objects get traded. Ideas get traded. Religious ideas, music, recipes, whatever. You know, they're just people. You really have to think about these people. So, hey, what's going on with you? And you meet somebody new and you learn something new and you go back and you talk about it. And you bring back other things not so good like influenza or cholera or smallpox.
Okay. So
we have another couple hours, right?
So in scouting, they have the
Order of the Arrow.
Is there a conflict or rub, or is there anything going on with that?
I would say, from my point of view, there's a big thing going on with that. There should be a big thing going on with that. And part of it is that, and I think the Boy Scouts in the end is doing a better job of saying, we want to learn the skills and the techniques and the technology that are required to do these things, to create a drum or moccasins or whatever, or regalia. But for them, they can't call it regalia. It's not regalia. It's a costume. It's a dance costume. And I think that using proper language helps to identify who you are doing it as an art artist, and what your intent is. Am I trying to pass myself off as a Native person, or am I, like myself, no Native ancestry? I started doing beadwork when I was 8 or whatever, and my sister can attest that there's beads everywhere. There have always been beads everywhere. And so we have to be honest with other people on who we are, why we do what we do. Why I do beadwork? I really like the technical skill. I love the designs. I like the way that it's all put together. I'm an object person. I'm a cultural object person. Robert just asked me, who gave you the little African doll? Because it's an Ndebele doll and it has all kinds of beadwork on it. I said, oh, hi. So that's what drew me, and I have to be upfront about that. So I think as long as the Boy Scouts are upfront about why they're doing what they're doing, what skills, what is it that you want your Boy Scouts to get out of that, and focus on that, and the Native skills are an avenue to that. I think that that's the way that they're approaching that now. Before, it was a little too Indian club kind of thing for me. So, one more.
Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Yes. Oh, my.
Braiding Sweetgrass. I just absolutely love the book. And, does she romanticize nature? Or
No, she does not.
It's just not, oh, I don't know about it.
No. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Dr. Kimmerer is a botanist. She's also, is she not?
I'm not sure.
She's tribally enrolled. And if you have not read Braiding Sweetgrass, I highly recommend it because it does two things for you. One is it introduces you to the way Native people who have been taught their Native knowledge, how they interface that information in today's society. But also she's a botanist. She's a trained botanist. She has her PhD. And she intertwines those stories remarkably well. She is a phenomenal person. I had her as a botany instructor, didn't know any of that. Else I would have been an ethnobotanist for sure. Yeah, I would have gone that route. So I would highly recommend that book. And her first book was called Gathering Moss, so it's a much smaller read. But Braiding Sweetgrass, you would have to read like a chapter and then kind of think about it for a while and read another chapter. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about what you said about the Choctaws being involved in the Wycliffe mounds.
Chickasaw.
Did you say Chickasaw? Because I heard Choctaw.
Oh, well, I meant to say Chickasaw.
Chickasaw
Sorry.
makes sense to me. So,
Chickasaw.
All right, so that answers my question.
Yes, sorry about that. There are Choctaw people here, but I misspoke. It should be Chickasaw. Thank you for catching that. Yes, ma'am.
Can you just clarify for me, in one of the laws that you mentioned, I think it was the one about the marketing, the crafts, it distinguished between American Indian and Alaska Native.
Yes.
What is that? I mean, obviously I know the natives for Alaska, but why are they, is that delineated?
Probably because the federal government uses a federal definition of American Indians, which includes American Indians is one thing, and Alaska Native and Native Hawaiians are two other groups. So when you see it lumped together on a federal document, it's American Indian and Alaska Native. They're always separated out. And if you think about the numbers, there's a whole lot more Alaska Natives than any individual tribe. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons. Yeah. And I did bring some posters in. The one-color posters are free for you to take. If you like the color version, the Kentucky Archaeological Survey needs to have $10 from you so we can reprint them. So the one color are free, I've got plenty. The multicolored poster, which is really quite nice, is $10. And my brochures and my cards are back there. If you want to contact me, I'm happy to stay and answer more questions, whatever y'all want to do.
reminder that part 2 will be next month on July 13th at 1 p.m. right here. Dr. Brandon, Thank you all.